Hello, Eric here again, and in this video I want to talk about the definition of science fiction. One of your first assignments in this course is to come up with a good definition of science fiction that shows that you understand what the genre is and that you can discuss the genre with a foundation that makes some sense. I thought in this video I would start by sharing some definitions that come from some of the most famous science fiction writers ever. I spaced them out by 20 years. Each one is about 20 years apart, but they are by three of the big original sci-fi writers. So the first one is Theodore Sturgeon, and this is how he defined science fiction in 1952. He said, "Science fiction story is a story built around human beings with a human problem and a human solution, which would not have happened at all without the scientific content." I think the last part is really hammers home what is really important about science fiction. It would not have happened at all without the scientific content. I'm going to come back to that in a little while. In 1975, Isaac Asimov, perhaps at some point the most famous science fiction writer ever, said science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. It's a little broader than Sturgeon's definition in some ways and a little narrower in other ways, but what they have in common is that the science is central to the story. The actual science has to matter to the story. It cannot just be incidental. Lastly, in 2000, Arthur C. Clarke said, "Science fiction is something that could happen, but you usually wouldn't want it to. Fantasy is something that couldn't happen, though you often only wish that it could." So the reason why I end with Clarke's definition is because he also mentions fantasy, and he defines science fiction in contrast to fantasy. Before we get into that argument or discussion, which includes many famous people such as Ursula Le Guin and Margaret Atwood, we want to think a little bit about speculative fiction. So speculative fiction is the umbrella term that includes genre fiction of various types. Science fiction, fantasy, historical revision sort of fictions, which are called alternate histories. If you are familiar with some of the other subgenres of speculative fiction, you might be interested in cyberpunk or steampunk. There are, vampires and werewolves. Within the speculative fiction realm, there are lots of subgenres that are covered by that term. Science fiction is one of those subgenres, and under science fiction there are other subgenres as well. And sometimes you will find that there are subgenres that are combined, so it would be a science fiction fantasy. I hope that you see that what I'm trying to say is that these genres and subgenres are flexible. They are not set in stone, and even as the definitions that these famous authors provided show, there's some flexibility in how you think about it. The one thing that is in common with all of them is science, or science and technology. Those elements must be there for something to be science fiction. So I thought I would go through just a very quick sort of list. I'll start with things that are definitely science fiction and give you a few examples. Things that are in a gray area where you can potentially discuss them in your post this week. If you disagree with my assessment, you might provide some alternate way of thinking. And then things that are profoundly not science fiction. And so I hope that you don't, venture into those realms and sort of identify some of those things as science fiction. So let's start with stuff that is absolutely definitely science fiction. I'm going to start with a couple films, a few movies, because I think that often people who are new to science fiction are more familiar with the movies than the literature. And so here I'm thinking of Interstellar, which was a movie with Matthew McConaughey from a few years back that involved time travel and black holes. And I'm also thinking of Arrival, which was a movie from a couple years ago that was based on the Ted Chiang story, Story of Your Life, which incidentally happens to be the final story that we read in this course. In that movie, aliens are circling Earth in their spaceship, and they are working with a linguist to try to communicate with us. So those movies are science fiction because the science is absolutely central to the storyline. In Interstellar, they have to understand the dynamics of a black hole. In Arrival, they are trying to work out how the varying biologies of the aliens who are visiting, which are very different than us, how those things define their language and how we can translate something from our language to their language. A traditional science fiction story that is definitely science fiction might be something like Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. This is when a spaceship from an alien civilization is passing through our solar system. It's coming close to our sun. We don't know what they're here for or what they're going to do, and so a team of astronauts goes and explores this alien spacecraft. In this story, Clarke is trying to imagine how you would capture a planetary biology in an interstellar spacecraft that would travel through space for decades, millennia. The science is central to that story. So moving on from the stories that are definitely science fiction, the works that are definitely science fiction, we may also look at works that are in the gray area, things that are sort of science fiction. So here I'm going to start with the most famous one of all, Star Wars. Star Wars is sort of science fiction. There are spaceships, there are instances where advanced technology come into play, there are alien civilizations whose biology and physiology matter to the story, but there are also very strong good and evil themes. People fight with handheld weapons when there are projectile weapons available. There's a lot about Star Wars which is speculative, of course, but it's maybe a little bit more like fantasy. When I said that you could mix those genres and have a fantasy science fiction, Star Wars was pretty much what I had in mind. I would say that Star Wars is generally still accepted as a science fiction series because it has a lot of the foundational elements of sci-fi stories, and it itself is based kind of largely on work by previous science fiction writers, particularly Frank Herbert's Dune, and George Lucas actually got the idea of a Wookiee from George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire fame. So Star Wars has a tradition of being connected to science fiction. It has clear science fiction elements, but there are some parts where the science doesn't really matter so much. It kind of becomes a Lord of the Rings style fantasy story that's good versus evil. Another area that I might say is gray is superhero, Marvel Comics, those sorts of movies. Science fiction writer Ted Chiang absolutely says those things are not science fiction. I tend generally to agree with him. That's because the science is only really incidental. As the authors that I cited originally said, for something to really be science fiction, science has to be central. It has to matter to the conflict, it has to matter to the characters. If the science wasn't part of the story, then the story would not be able to happen. In superhero stories, sometimes science is an excuse for why things are happening. You know, the X-Men are mutants, and the mutants are allegedly, I guess, caused by some sort of genetic mutation, but this gives Cyclops the ability to just blast lasers out of his eyes, and this gives some of the other characters, Gambit just throws cards and they explode. I don't really know how exploding cards are explained by any sort of a mutation. There's a nod to science, but it's not central to the conflict. The characters are a little bit more like characters from fantasy. And indeed, some of these superhero stories are straight up fantasy. You know, Thor and Captain America, these kind of things. I guess Captain America has some sort of power from some pseudoscientific source. But they basically just matter. It matters that they have a superpower. You know, Superman is an alien, but he arrived on Earth, grew up as a boy, just like us, and looks like just like us, cares about our values, wants to maintain the structure of society. One of the things that Ted Chiang says that makes it hard to consider superhero stories science fiction is that science fiction is often about how society changes and how society develops. And superhero stories are often about how society stays the same. Superman has these incredible powers to save the universe and save the world from all these catastrophes, but he doesn't do anything about climate change. He doesn't do anything about oppressive government actions and the sorts of real life experiences that people struggle with. So I would say that superhero stories are one of those things. Yeah, Spider-Man was bit by a spider before he got spider powers, but how does being bit by a spider, even if it's a radioactive spider, How does it give you spider powers? Those things in the gray area are interesting to talk about. I'll throw one more in there. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a fun comedy takeoff of science fiction stories. It's definitely connected to the genre. It's loved by science fiction fans. Does the science really matter? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so I would put that one in the gray area as well. Like I said, you might want to argue in your discussion post about those gray area science fiction stories, the ones that may or may not reasonably belong in the science fiction genre. I also want to talk about some that are not science fiction at all. And this comes from having taught the course for quite some time and having people submit these stories as examples of science fiction in their posts. And so the two I'm going to talk about are Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings are absolutely not science fiction. Science is not central to those stories. Science doesn't matter at all. Science in those stories is replaced by magic. And magic is very different than science. Science is something that needs a physical description and explanation. For example, Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, he actually imagines what a spaceship that traveled between stars could potentially look like. I guess you could say that J.K. Rowling actually imagined what a school for wizards would be like, but there's never going to be a school for wizards, ever. It is possible that an alien spacecraft may pass through our solar system and it might look like something that Clarke described. That's the main difference. They're both speculative fiction. That's definitely true. But as Clarke said, fantasy is something that couldn't happen, although that you wish it could. Science fiction is something that could happen, although you often wish it wouldn't. Same thing goes with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is the fantasy story. J.R.R. Tolkien was a scholar of Beowulf and other medieval texts. He based his Elvish language on the medieval languages that he studied. He based the stories of Lord of the Rings on the medieval tales and legends that he studied. Lord of the Rings is awesome. It's based on history. It's based on culture. It's based on art. It's based on language. There's so many great things about Lord of the Rings, but there's no science in it. And the science would not, there's no connection. So when you're thinking about your definition of science fiction, I hope that you'll take the definitions I provided into consideration and then think a little bit about the examples I gave you. You'll notice that the ones that I said are science fiction if you're an established science fiction reader. The examples I gave that are definitely science fiction are often things that we would consider hard science fiction. There are other stories that are clearly science fiction, which may not be hard science fiction. I'm thinking of something like Solaris by Stanislaw Lem or Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. It would be interesting to know, from if you are someone who really already thinks deeply about science fiction, where do you draw the line between hard sci-fi and other definite sci-fi? If you're someone who's maybe not as versed in the genre and you want to talk about the gray areas, the superhero stories, that's fine. I'm interested in reading about that too. Please don't tell me Harry Potter is a science fiction story. I look forward to seeing what you come up with, and I'll be responding to you soon.